Good evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you're watching this. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are at number 5 of Swami's 26 Keys to Higher Awareness. Last week I was reading very carefully off a card that said pajamas on the back because I had repurposed some index cards. So I almost brought it again, but then this is it. You see it's blank. Why I have an index card that says pajamas, I'll just leave you to speculate, and I'm not going to really even explain it. Okay, friends, here we are. Number 5, these 26 keys, as I've been mentioning to you, except for the first one, these next 4 or 5 all have dealt with physical realities. Number 2 is exercise regularly with deep attention. Number 3 is practice breathing deeply several times a day. And number 4 is about posture. Make a practice of holding your body erect, whether standing or sitting. These are all very interesting. It doesn't stay on the physical plane forever, but this is a nice starting point. And this one is, number 5, develop a preference for foods that are high in energy and nutrients, as opposed to those which merely stick to the ribs. I suppose for men, they think about sticking to the ribs. Women, we think about sticking to our hips, but it's all the same thing. Remember, diet plays an important role in your mental as well as your physical well-being. Okay, so food, diet, everything like that, it's a very, very interesting subject and an important one spiritually, so I'm going to pick it up from several different angles. For many people, and I presume it's the same now as it was when I started out on the path, very often you start taking charge of your life with your diet. And so diet is sometimes a kind of a transition learning stage where you begin to recognize the cause and effect relationship. Whereas until we begin to think more deeply, life is just a bewildering experience of consecutive events, and we don't necessarily have a clear concept of cause and effect. And somewhere in that process of just letting life move us rather than actually taking command of our own lives, we have to find some starting point. And food and diet are often a very interesting starting point. Nowadays, with so many food allergies, a lot of times people are forced into a concern for food that they really wouldn't have taken on otherwise. I was talking to a young man in his early 20s who has a severe, as it turns out, gluten intolerance. And it was so frustrating to him because he wanted to be kind of a happy-go-lucky, I can handle anything sort of guy. But he was finding out that he simply had no tolerance. And he was traveling and so on, and it was very inconvenient for him. But I pointed out to him, here's the positive side, because he is a yogi. I said, look, it's perfectly controllable. This is not like a life-threatening, debilitating disease. It simply means that you're going to have to live consciously and with a lot of self-control. I mean, it could be worse. It's nice to have something where if I live consciously with self-control, then I feel well. And if I don't, I don't. Of course, it is something relatively unimportant, which is merely controlling your palate, which is not the same as controlling your heart and your mind. But nonetheless, it's a good starting place. I myself, being a child of the 60s, as I've mentioned in other contexts, I was part of the early American baby boomer scene when we began to think in terms of alternatives to the obvious. And one of the things that we really did start in with very early, and this is the mid to late 60s for me, was really thinking about diet. I became a vegetarian at that time. One of my relatives was so sure I would die without eating meat that she demanded that I give her a complete list of absolutely everything I ate. And I was so conscious about everything I ate that her doctor pronounced it the healthiest diet he'd ever seen, predicted I'd live to be 150, and that was sort of the end of that conversation. But it was that radical, that it was just unheard of to be doing that. And we were also there at the beginning of the whole idea of what Swami's writing here, which is that what is the nutritional value of what I'm eating? And not merely does it taste good, does it have a list of how many percentage of all my vitamins am I getting on it? Does the box have a list of these things? what is the real, we thought in terms of nutritional value. Over the years, I've refined my vocabulary, which I'll share with you as we progress through here. But we were very radical at that time, and I've actually said in other contexts that my confidence in the idea that eventually the principles by which I have lived my whole life of self-realization and dharma, meditation, relationship to God, I have a lot of confidence that eventually, from the ground up, these ideas will be accepted, because I've witnessed the organic and the natural foods revolution from the beginning. I was way out there in the front of it, and I've just watched all of society just, come to our side. And you might think of it like a river runs. Swami often talks about this. A river runs along a certain path. The river of society just flows along a certain way. And then people will step outside of that and start creating another vortex. And if he was talking in this sense about the benefit of people working together, small groups of like-minded people banding together, he said have a lot of power. And he uses a lot of examples, including the Renaissance and the Transcendentalists in the East, in the American East Coast, and the left bank writers in Paris, and even the Bolshevik Revolution. A small group of people, but who were very in tune with each other and worked together, can influence the whole direction of society. And what happens is that society is flowing along its own channel, and when you get a group of people who begin to generate magnetism in a certain way, just literally the flow of society ends up running through that circle. In terms of the real work that I'm involved in, which is more than just diet, which is Master's teachings, of course, Kriya Yoga, self-realization, the community ideal, lots of things. As I see society moving over into where we're standing, vegetarianism, natural foods are the least of it, organic farming, now some understanding of yoga, some understanding of meditation. Far from feeling my work here is done, it's really time to move over farther and just keep moving over farther until we've really accomplished a total revolution. Because, well, diet's what we're talking about today, but it's just the beginning. But what I've seen is that as I said, all the natural foods and organic farming and all of that has just become, and increasingly so, it's becoming business. It's the good old American way. There's money in it. But it works. It does work. Free enterprise, people take the initiative. There's something positive can happen here. No government ever legislated it. It just happened because people woke up to the possibility. So back from the mid-'60s into the end of the '60s, I was becoming interested in spiritual things, but I was also intensely focused on diet, nutrition, the food value of things. And the thing that interested me the most, I never studied it scientifically. As I think about it now, it was more almost vibrationally, is the word natural. And not the word natural that's just pasted onto every box that you see, but just really natural. And my thought form was, how close is whatever it is that I'm going to take into my body to the form that God made it? How close is it to the way it came out of the ground or just grew up? And so if you went to Jack in the Box or Burger King or any of those things, and you pick up one of their white bread sandwiches, and you just sort of look at it like, how close did God create this? Now, of course, God created everything, but how natural is the form I'm looking at? White bread was very popular then. As a little child, one of my favorite sandwiches was a piece of white bread, and I would spread it with margarine and then sprinkle it with white sugar and then fold it over. It was just one of my favorites. I mean, really, how much actual food value is there in that? You wonder how we grew up at all. My dear mother, who later, after we left home, became very interested in nutrition, and she was inspired by, I don't even know if people read her anymore, a woman named Adele Davis, who just scared the living daylights out of you, talking about the paucity of nutrition in the food that we eat. And I remember my mother apologizing to me for the way she'd fed us growing up after she became more conscious of all of this. But there I was folding my little white bread over. But when you hold a piece of white bread in your hand, like how many processes has this piece of bread gone through from whenever it was harvested as wheat until I'm putting it into my body and expecting it to give me some energy. The whole point of eating is that there's prana, there's actual life force in food. And the body, by whatever its biological methods are, it can convert the life force that's trapped in an apple, and it consumes it, and then it becomes your life force. Now, to cut to the end of how I eventually came to in all of this, is that the question always is, does it take more life force to process this substance I'm eating, to digest it, to masticate, to digest, and to eliminate what isn't going to be useful to me? Does it take more life force out of me to process this food than there is prana in it to energize me? And of course, the human body is amazing, and the human will is amazing, because food is not our only source of energy. We get energy directly by willpower, just drawing it from the universe. We get energy from the sun, we get energy from air. So children, some of my friends have what they call air children, children who just eat so little but nonetheless just manage. Or you have people who eat just horribly but manage to stay strong because in other ways, but it takes its toll. That's simply what happens. It takes its toll. Either eventually your body breaks down, or if you happen to have really good health karma and you squander it on careless living, then eventually, and that's not a curse, but that's a probability, depending whether or not you're actually tuned into other sources of energy, or whether you're just squandering your good karma by being careless and not taking care of the gifts that you were given. So in my early years, it became really like how close to its natural form. And I never got into raw foods or anything like that. People go back that far. I never did. But I was always conscious of what is this made of and where did it come from. In those early years, I had a friend who worked for General Mills, which is the company at that time, I don't know if they still exist, that made all the packaged cereals that we as little children in America were certainly raised on, Cheerios and Wheaties and Sugar Pops and Frosted Flakes and all kinds of other things that God never made on his own without a lot of intervention from who knows who. And he was an accountant for that company. And he was very knowledgeable, and he informed us, what a tiny percentage of the total expenditure of the company was actually on the food that you consumed. That it was primarily on the advertising, it was on the salaries for the people who worked there, it was on the packaging, and then at the very bottom, literally at the very bottom of the whole budget, was the actual food that they were selling to us. And those were the days when you would take a food that had been utterly devitalized, and then you would spray it with liquid vitamins. And then you would write on the box, this provides all these vitamins, as if it was inherent in what you were eating. It was really the Frosted Flakes became just a carrier for the liquid vitamins. You might as well have popped a pill, except that you had a pleasant feeling of fullness, but you also your body had to process all of that. But he literally told us, after studying it for some time, that you should throw away the cereal and eat the box. He said there was more nutritional content in the actual cardboard box than there was in the cereal inside. Whether true or apocryphal, I don't know, but I've always remembered that. And it's a point worth knowing. So we're talking on many different levels. I haven't even touched the subject of vegetarianism, but just the whole idea. Now, before I go, well, I'll talk about vegetarianism for a moment too, and then I'm just going to be all over the map today. Vegetarianism is a very interesting part of right and proper nutrition. Sri Yukteswar makes a very strong point of the fact that we do not have the digestive system of a carnivore, that a carnivore has a very different digestive system than we do, and that ours is designed for plant material and well designed for fruits, but just fruits and vegetables are really, he doesn't make a specific mention about grain, but grain is a plant. And that's what our bodies are designed, and when we fill our bodies with animal flesh of various kinds, we tax the system in a way that it is not meant. And that's my principle of it takes more energy to consume it than it actually gives you in life force. Now, when Yogananda came to this country in 1920, he had so many radical things to tell people that he did not feel that an emphasis on vegetarianism was really so important compared to everything else that he had to offer, especially not for that first generation. By the time Swami Kriyananda was a disciple in 1948, 1950, Master was emphasizing vegetarianism, but still he always did it somewhat lightly, or not emphatically is how I would put it. The reasons for vegetarianism are manyfold. One of them is just simply that you can get the nutrition that you need from other sources that give more energy to the body than they take away. There's also a great deal of evidence nowadays about how many other debilitating diseases, including cancer, are caused by the consuming of animal flesh, especially red meat and pork, which Master said you should stay away from above all. But he graded things. You know, fish is lighter than beef and chicken and lamb, he said, are all better than beef or anything made from a pig. So there is just simply that. There's so much written about that, I'm not going to really go into it for a long time. The other side of it, which Master said is quite different, especially about pigs and cows, he said, is the animal is conscious of being slaughtered, and the animal doesn't want to die. And that consciousness of being dragged to its death against its own will leaves a vibration of both fear and anger in the flesh of the animal. I mean, that's quite a statement. It's not that those animals are, you know, as conscious even as more elevated animals, which Masters say dogs, monkeys, and horses are the most intelligent animals. But nonetheless, you know, every living thing has built into it by the divine a desire to keep on living. And when you're raised and then taken away to be slaughtered, that's quite different than living out your natural term and knowing that it's time for you to go. To have your body forcibly taken away from you, Master said, leaves those vibrations. And so when you're taking in the flesh of that now dead animal, Master actually said you're taking in those vibrations of consciousness. And the most aggressive countries are often the ones who eat the most meat. And the most aggressive people, not always, but often, are people who are inclined that way. So when we start trying to pay attention to our consciousness, which is where I started, people often start with diet because they notice the cause and effect relationship between how I feel either physically, mentally, or emotionally and what I'm bringing into my body. Well, I mean, think about how intimate it is to bring it into your body. You don't go around picking up, you know, awful things on the ground and sucking on them and trying to bring them inside of you because it inherently feels icky. We've been, Sri Yukteswar says, our taste buds have been distorted to the point where we feel gleeful about a piece of dead animal on our plate. And I've been a vegetarian for so long, and so I was saying, when we start developing this sensitivity both to the effect on our consciousness and also just in general to the fact that, you know, this used to be a living creature, and we don't even participate in that cycle. We have it all done completely out of sight so that you're just picking up some finished product. There may be something inherently more in keeping with the flow of nature if you were to kill and process your own animals, but I don't really know. But I do know that we don't think about it when we pick it up in the market, that this was a living creature. And there's always this moment with little children when they find out that the hamburger that they love used to be the cow that they love, or the chicken that they're eating used to be the chicken that they saw at Ananda Farm when they went out there for a farm day. And very often children become extremely disturbed by the realization that, because they're always encouraged to be sweet to animals and love animals, and you read all these farm books and you're making the sounds of old MacDonald's farm, and then you realize you're sitting at the dinner table and this is a dead version of what you were just being so sweet to. And once in our school, someone came in and gave a strong talk about vegetarianism. Our school, I should tell you, is just a tuition-based private school in the Palo Alto area. And even though we encourage high-minded behavior, it's not required. And so there was a discussion of vegetarianism, and the children found out where their food comes from. And parents, some of them were quite upset with us, but it's the truth. You can't hide these things. If it's upsetting to children, it needs to be faced. There's several videos, which I'm sure you can find easily on YouTube, where parents face their adorable children, discovering that their dinner is a dead animal, and then often weeping or just crying out in protest, I don't want the animals to be dead. And sometimes small children will hold to that. Too often their parents will try to talk them out of it. Your child is developing a more refined consciousness and a more healthy orientation. Why would you try to talk him out of it? Except to keep him in your camp. We have to think very carefully about these things. And there's much evidence nowadays about the health. There's also just, how do we want to participate on this planet? Nowadays, a lot of people are vegetarian, even vegan, for essentially what you would call ecological reasons. That, we can live more lightly, fair distribution of resources. How much does it take to grow and slaughter one cow? How many people could be fed by all that goes into that one cow? If everybody on the planet went vegetarian, how the world food supply would change. I think these are very noble causes. If you feel it, if it is a sufficient ideal that it motivates you, I think it's an ideal worth following. At the same time, of course, we create a small vortex like this, and then society gets channeled into our vortex. Let's not do it with anger, though. That's the word I'm coming to. In a completely other context, Swamiji was talking about you can't defeat delusion with delusion. And if people are behaving in a way motivated by darkness, if you want to call it darkness, to slaughter and eat animals, but you become angry at them, your anger is also a delusion. And that anger, one delusion against another will not defeat either of them. It will just increase the amount of delusion in the world. If you can do it peaceably, with a positive attitude, in the hope that both by putting your life in line with Dharma, you will be right with the world yourself, and by behaving in a dharmic manner, that will create a greater vortex for Dharma. These are very noble things to do, and we can always hope for the best. There's also, I mentioned consciousness about vegetarianism. When you begin to try to meditate, and you're trying to liberate your body from the hold that the physical body has on us, and the hold of the physical body is really enormous. People can talk about not wanting to be influenced by it, but we're enormously influenced by it. We're hungry, we're cold, we have powerful survival, we have sexual desires. When our stomach is upset, our brain doesn't work so very well. If you get illnesses, it's hard to overcome them. If your hormones are out of balance, your moods are out of balance. A woman's menstrual cycle radically influences her moods, menopause, andropause, all these different things that happen to people change the way we think and feel. And some of them we can't always control, but when we start to meditate, we begin to try to liberate our consciousness from the hold that the material plane has on us, And if we're serious about our meditation, we begin to pay attention to those things which facilitate our meditation and those things which work against it. I have myself a deep aversion to alcohol and recreational drugs and things that just pull your consciousness down. All kinds of alcoholic beverages, they draw you into subconsciousness. And it's working exactly the opposite of where we're trying to go. We're trying to go to superconscious, and then we take a chemical substance that pulls us into subconsciousness. I know some people have a struggle, to free themselves with those things, but we need to pay attention. How is this affecting my consciousness? And Swamiji points out there's, as he puts it, a long-term effect of drinking alcohol that gradually coarsens our consciousness because it consistently draws us down into subconsciousness. And so meat and killing animals has that same effect. It coarsens us a little bit. And many people I love are carnivores. And many fine people on the planet are carnivores, altruistic, wonderful, noble, artistic. Now, because this is the other side of it, it's just diet. When I arrived at Ananda Village in 1971, as I said, I was intensely interested in diet to the point of fanaticism, I think. I never had sugar, I never had processed foods. I was always a vegetarian. I was a ovo-lacto vegetarian. That's what you call it when you take dairy products and eggs. Being vegan was not so common, and it never occurred to me to be vegan. Although at times I did leave off eggs. I began to develop an icky relationship to eggs, which I've gone back to them completely. But they felt icky to me for a while. But when I got to Ananda Village, I was convinced, in a quiet way, that I must be quite near to samadhi, because it had been at least 3 years since I'd had any sugar. And one of my earliest memories of Swami Kriyananda, and he knew that I was a fanatic in this respect. I very soon moved in and started running the kitchen, and my fanaticism began to come out in a way that was not real popular. I'll finish that story in a moment, but somewhere in that period of time, I went with Swami Kriyananda in a group of about a dozen people into the local town of Nevada City, Grass Valley. I know I've told this in another webinar, but this is the context in which it happened. And afterwards, we went to one of our favorite one of their favorite places to go. I was new in town. Nevada City, Grass Valley was very simple then. It was not the big tourist destination, the big upscale sort of refuge for yuppies from the Bay Area or anything like that. It was just a very simple town at that point. And so Swenson's ice cream shop was a really great part of town. And it was the habit of Swamiji, who had a great fondness for sweets, never out of proportion, but he always liked dessert, to go to the ice cream parlor. And it was also a way just to have fun. Everybody's happy around ice cream. So whoever was with him, we would all go into Swenson's and usually have a banana split or a ice cream sundae or something like that. Going into town was a really big deal. And if you went once a week, that was the most. Often you would go only every couple of weeks. So having one ice cream sundae, that often was not like a big deal. So we went in there, a dozen of us, and there was a long table, and Swami sat at the foot of the table as it happened, and I sat at the head of the table. I don't remember him arranging things like that, but he may have influenced it. So I sat at the head of the table, or the foot. He was at the head of the table. And everybody was ordering ice cream and talking about the menu and, the virtues of caramel versus fudge and the chocolate chip ice cream versus the plain vanilla, and should we get strawberries, and what about the banana split, and what are the toppings, just on and on. And I ordered a glass of water with no ice. One of my other fetishes, not to drink cold water. And I sat with my glass of water while everyone around me went through these very happy, laughing, ordering, having fun with the waitress. Then they got all these big ice cream dishes, and they're passing them across, and everybody's got a spoon, and Swami's tasting everyone's, and everyone's tasting what he has, and I sat sipping my water like this. Fortunately, And I thank God and Guru for this every day. I had the brains to figure out that the one who was out of tune was probably me. It would have been very easy to decide that Swami Kriyananda was the one who was out of tune, because after all, I know about these things and I know this isn't good for you. And people do make that kind of decision a lot. They take some small little thing that they're clinging to. And diet and religion, and raising children, people can be so fanatical. And I was fanatical, but I also noticed that I wasn't having as much joy as they were having. Plus, I'd come there to learn from Swami Kriyananda. And if he was putting up in front of me something so opposite to what I was already committed to, it behooved me to listen. And I did. Not that I changed right away, but it put a little chink in there. And then I was running the kitchen at what was then called the meditation retreat, which was really our only retreat. And in fact, many of the residents also lived up there. This would be 71, 72. And we lived very, very, well, I will use the word primitive. Simple is the nice word. Primitive is the actuality. And no one, except one or two people, had kitchens. So everyone, all the residents, had to eat all their meals in the community kitchen where I was the cook. And I was a fanatic. And I also was a bad cook, because making it taste good just wasn't part of my construct. Food was very theoretical to me. If it was wholesome, it was good. And if it was wholesome, somehow I thought it tasted good. Swami later said that I was so caught up in my mind, I actually couldn't tell what it tasted like, which I think is actually exactly right. I couldn't get into my taste buds because I was so tight in my head. But I cooked healthy food for people. And then it came toward the winter, and I was keen on cooking out of the garden. But as winter approached, the only two crops that we had were Jerusalem artichokes. And Jerusalem artichokes bear no resemblance to California artichokes. California artichokes are the green plant with all the leaves that you get to dip in delicious sauces. Jerusalem artichokes look a little bit like ginger root. They're just this sort of twisted kind of gray thing. They're extremely nutritious, and they grew like crazy on the Ananda land. And they were a pet product of a pet vegetable of the man who ran our garden, because they are extremely efficient food. They taste terrible is the problem. For most people don't like them. You can eat them raw like a beet or a carrot. It's a root vegetable, or you can cook them. Actually, grated up raw in a salad, even still, I like them. I've yet to find a way of cooking them that even I, who have a very broad range, don't find horrible. But I just didn't think about that. And so we had Jerusalem artichokes, and the other product that we grew was kale. Kale has become incredibly trendy. Everybody thinks kale is just really like the bee's knees now, but at that time, that's not how people felt about it. And I also liked kale raw in salads. I mean, now everybody eats it, but in 1971, they didn't. So I was feeding the community at least once, often twice a day, meals that were made out of Jerusalem artichokes and kale, which are very difficult to make taste good, and I made very little effort to make them taste good. They were organic, they were from our garden, and they were really super, super healthy foods. And there was actually a palace revolt. I mean, the whole community went to Swami and just said, do something, do something. This is just a nightmare. And by that point, it had begun to occur to me that I was the one who was off. And it wasn't that I was off in my understanding of healthy foods, but I was off in the lack of attunement to other realities, and my disproportionate idea that spirituality and diet were the same thing. And that's really the key. And much later, then just to finish this story, By that point, I started trying to make the food taste better, which is just, this is a side story. I was trying to make it better, but I just didn't know how. And this is where I think I was still so caught in my mind, was so mental as a person. I couldn't get into my body enough to tell whether it tasted good. And Swami approached me and sort of, in his way, he started the conversation very lightly. This is how Swami would always do things. If he had something he wanted to tell you, he would approach it very gently, and he would see how you responded. And if you showed receptivity, he would take another step. But if you blocked what he was trying to tell you, he would just back away. Because, except in rare cases, there was simply no point in trying to break down your defenses. The way we learn is when we want to learn. So he made some comment about the dish that I made. It was a little bland, he said. At which point I said, and I had tried really hard that day to make it good, and even I could tell it was a little bland. And I said, oh, yes, Swamiji, I know. I don't know why it came out that way. And then he said, in fact, much of what you cook is a little bland. Yes, Swamiji, I would like to make it different. He said, I could teach you to cook. And I said, please, Swamiji, I would love to learn. So he said he would teach me to cook. And then a short time later, a Swami Nirmalananda came to spend the weekend with Swami. He was a disciple, had been a disciple of Anandamoyi Ma. That man is now called Father George, and he's become a Coptic Christian, some kind of a particular Christian sect. He's a good man, and he was a friend of Swami Kriyananda's. And I don't know what he's like now, but at that time he was also, there was a lot of him. He was a big, solid man, and he was, as P.G. Woodhouse calls, an able trencherman. And so he came to visit Swami for the weekend, and Swamiji invited me to come over and cook. And because Swami was going to teach me how to cook, because Swami himself was an excellent cook, just had a very sensitive palate and knew just how to make things just right. Not overdone, but just exactly right. And so for that whole weekend, every meal that we made, and we ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 2 or 3 days with Swamiji and Nirmalananda and a couple of other people. Every meal Swami and I cooked together. And when I arrived in my mental way with my notebook, and I was going to write down every little thing he did, and Swami was, and what I gradually learned to understand, is an intuitive cook. He just took a little of this and a little of that, and then he'd open the refrigerator and he'd throw this in, and if there was too much of that, he'd balance it with this. And I'm frantically trying to write all of this down. Once again, fortunately, I realized the problem was me. I folded up the notebook, I set it down, and I just started helping Swami cook, which meant handing him things or chopping an onion or an apple. But Swami did all of the actual making it good. But I just stood next to him for those 3 days. And the last meal, I remember we were all just sitting around on the floor very casually. Everything was much more casual with Swami then, and of course he was younger too. And we were trying to decide what to have for dinner. We decided we'd have a fruit salad, and one of the other people who was there, Seva, said, oh, well, I'll make it, Swamiji. And Swami said, okay, you go ahead. And then he said, no. Then he remembered, no. And then in this very exaggerated way, he said, I'm teaching Asha to cook, like that. And so we went up and we made fruit salad, which meant cutting the fruit, like that. But after that weekend was over on Monday morning, I knew how to cook. I don't have any idea. He connected me. And it was very interesting. He connected me to my intuition. And just to go on, because it's an interesting story. Cooking was the first thing I learned to do by intuition. And I was partly able to do it because, one, it was entirely a service to others, because I was quite content. I ate raw Jerusalem artichoke and kale salads for years, by choice, because I liked them. And I could just eat the same thing day after day, and if it was very plain, to this day, I'm like that. So it was for the service of others that I learned. And it was also in my personal value system at that particular time. It didn't have any importance. I was raised to value intellectual things And I just didn't see cooking as anything that mattered. So I wasn't afraid of failing at it, because it just didn't matter. I didn't need to succeed. And as a result, I believe Swami was able to really attune me, because there was all my usual blocks, self-interest and a fear of failure. We just weren't there. So on Monday morning, I knew how to cook, and I've known how to cook ever since. Know how in the sense that I can take ingredients and it comes out pretty well. And I use recipes, but I'm much more spontaneous. He just taught me how to do it. And then what happened, and this has been my guideline ever since, I began to cook for Swami somewhere around in there. He didn't have a full-time cook. He didn't need one. He was much more able to take care of himself and preferred the solitude. So, but when guests came over, or when he started writing the path and was just way too busy to cook for himself, I gradually began to cook for him. And I learned to cook to his taste, because I didn't know how to cook before, and then most of my cooking was for him. So I learned to cook to his taste. Some of that was, idiosyncratic to him. He never liked beets, no matter how I tried to fix them for him. He allowed me on several occasions to try my absolute best beet recipe. He admitted that if he was going to like beets, he would have liked those beets, but no, he didn't like beets. And he would say, admittedly, I'm a finicky eater. He said, because in his childhood he had colitis, and for much of his childhood he was deprived. And he says, I'm finicky, I have my preferences, and that's that. But I learned to cook to his taste. But what I really learned to cook was to his philosophy, which was, if it tastes good, your body's going to like it better. But taste is refined, and it needs to be refined, not too heavy, not too overdone, and fresh, vital, prana, but careful, not casually done, but careful, doing things in the right way, the way they're meant to be done. I was never very good at presenting them nicely, but when his housekeepers became the people who began to cook for him, were good at that. Just, I would say I can get it ready, but someone else has to get it to the table. But from Swami, I learned a balanced attitude. And that was really what Master wanted. Master wanted a proper ecologianism, is what he called it. He didn't even like vegetarian. He thought it was still just too leaning toward the fanatical, because even like his disciple, Dr. Lewis, started developing a lot of pain in his body. And Master diagnosed it as that your cells are accustomed to eating meat, and you've been a pure vegetarian here. He said, you need to eat a little fish once a week or so. And as soon as he started doing that, Dr. Lewis, the pains went away. And so even though he was a foremost disciple of Master, he always ate a little fish, a little chicken, because his body just wasn't able to adjust. And in the context of Ananda, there are a number of people who either, because they can't overcome the desire, or because the body seems to demand it, or don't eat a pure vegetarian diet. And it matters, but not that much. And many years later, I heard Swami Kriyananda and Keshavadas, who was a teacher from India, who was a very nice man and a friend of Swamiji's, and I was serving them lunch, actually, at Swami's house, and the conversation started. I was either serving them or I was present. I'm picturing the moment, and I may have just been sitting at the table. By then, I may not have been cooking for him at that point. And the conversation went to diet. And they said a couple of things that are very, very interesting. And they said in higher ages, where the material world is much thinner, the veil between the worlds is thinner, when like Satya Yuga, where everybody's consciousness is more elevated, and we're just not as, the physical dimension just isn't as gross. I mean, think about Kali Yuga. For example, some of our friends recently went on a pilgrimage to Italy, and they visited the places. Ananda has a center in Assisi where St. Francis lived, and they went to Laverna, where St. Francis received the mark of the stigmata on his body. If you ever have an opportunity to go there, by all means you should go. And when I went to Laverna, I wasn't on this recent trip, but I've been to Laverna a few times, and it's the top of a mountain, and sometimes it can be just bitterly cold there, really cold. And I was there during one of the cycles when it was very cold, and I was very bundled up, and I went down into this little place they have. I can picture it, but I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it was a sort of a cave where Francis spent a lot of time in meditation. Big granite rock, freezing cold in there. I was all bundled up, and still I couldn't stay that long because it was so cold. If you're lucky, it won't be that cold when you go there. It's unpredictable. But after a while, I started thinking, Francis was often barefoot or in sandals. He just had one garment. He wasn't bundled up like this. And I started thinking, how could he stand it? And our friends who came back from Italy with all of these pictures of these from that era of people and how austere their lives were. Well, Swami made an interesting comment when we mentioned it. He said, but everybody's life was terribly austere and difficult. There was no central heating or air conditioning or, any of the things that we're so accustomed to. He said, in order to do any kind of physical austerity, you had to step pretty far outside, because what we would call austere was just everyday life. The physical world just gripped people a lot more. It was just a heavier time. Everything about the physical plane was more onerous. All the work was physical. People died much younger. They suffered from many diseases. The infant mortality rate was greater. The break from the dull routine of just keeping yourself alive. The material plane was very heavy. Now, into Dwapara Yuga as we are, the impact of the physical plane on us is much lighter. We're comfortable inside our houses, we're comfortable in our clothes, we can travel geographic, moving vast distances is very simple. Communication is easy across vast distances instantaneously around the world. The grip the physical plane has on confining our consciousness is much less. Space and time is being annihilated. We're generally not starving. We don't just have to do back-breaking labor. Well, we're just at the beginning of Dwapara. There's Treta Yuga beyond it. There's Satya Yuga beyond that. And all of it becomes, the grip of the material plane becomes lighter and lighter. And the vibrations, apparently, to hear Swamiji and Sant Keshav Das talking to each other about it, the veil between the physical and the spiritual world becomes thinner and thinner. Now, the end point of this is, they were talking about it, that just a little bit of physical purification, just a little bit of fasting or refinement of your diet, you can have a great impact on your spiritual perceptions, because the hold of the body is very light anyway, and just a little movement can free you of it. But in this age, the age that we're living in, it's just simply too gross. And you cannot refine your body sufficiently to break away from this plane in this yuga. And so the route to divine consciousness, is, they put it very simply, is not a pure stomach, it's a pure heart. Devotion, 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 devotion. That's how we make spiritual progress. And so Master said, properitarianism, avoid pork, avoid beef, eat fresh fruits and vegetables, and don't eat too much of it. He gave specific instructions. He even has a little list of everything, eat these things every day. And, a few specific things that he mentioned, that just almonds, carrots, just things, apple, things that keep you really vital, things that are very close to the way God made them. But then he said, find a diet that works for you and forget about it. And cultivate devotion, cultivate purity of heart. Because in this age, that's the airplane route. And maybe some other time. But it's almost the nature of this plane that when we get involved in diet, we tend to get too intense about it, too fanatical about it. You can see how all of these are balancing factors. I've told the story in my in the book I wrote about Swami Kriyananda, about the Christmas eggnog, and I'll just tell that story here because it was also sort of, I think, the final shifting. In fact, it may be that Swami taught me how to cook after the eggnog incident. I'm not certain. Yes, it must have been afterwards. Anyway, which would mean it was more the winter than the fall of that 71, 72 year. Swamiji wanted to have a real Christmas that year, and that was 1971. And Anand had been in existence since 1968, 69, but it was really coming together around that time. And I believe this was the first time that we had this big Christmas Eve party. Maybe there'd been something before, but Swami was really supervising this Christmas Eve party, and he really wanted, we were going to do these certain things. He was defining Ananda life, because we didn't really know. I'd never even celebrated Christmas because I was raised Jewish. I had no idea. And most of us didn't know how to celebrate spiritual Christmas. We knew Christmas with our families, but we didn't understand how to really celebrate the birth of Christ. So we had the all-day Christmas meditation, which was Master's tradition. We had a banquet after, we had the meditation the day before Christmas, or the day before the day before. I think it was already on the 23rd. That's right. We meditated on the 23rd. On the 24th, we had a Christmas party. On the 25th, we had a banquet. And Swami was supervising all of this. He wanted an Indian banquet, and he taught me how to make Indian food for that banquet. And for the Christmas Eve party, he wanted to have eggnog. Not with liquor, but, without. And he thought eggnog would be very festive and very nice. And he had a recipe, which became known as Swami's eggnog. But he actually said he got it off the bulletin board at the local supermarket. And it was a very straightforward recipe. It called for Eagle brand sweetened condensed milk. It called for sugar and milk. I think those were, and then vanilla. I think those are and whipped cream. Those are the basic ingredients. So he gave me the recipe, and I was supposed to make it. I looked at it and thought, Eagle brand condensed milk, not a good idea. All that sugar, not a good idea. All that milk. Now here my frugality came in. All that because we were accustomed to using a lot of powdered milk. It wasn't really that people had forced upon me that frugality, but that was my thinking. And those were the days when you thought, if it looked vaguely like the real thing, then you could substitute it. That was the famous, instead of chocolate cheesecake, somebody made a carob tofu cheesecake, which was close to the worst thing even I could tell that I had ever tasted. But you see, you could duplicate the color and the texture, and we were so fanatical that we couldn't tell the difference. Well, anyway, so I was supposed to make eggnog. I couldn't buy the condensed milk. I didn't want to use sugar. And I don't know what I was thinking with the powdered milk. Oh, I know what the deal was with the powder. Oh, it was even worse. Oh, yes, it was even worse. Condensed milk is just milk in which a lot of the water has been boiled away. So I could make, I was out of my mind. I could make condensed milk by using twice as much powder. I never actually really followed through. I was completely out of my mind. And I had this raw honey that we used. So I made very thick powdered milk, and I sweetened it with raw honey. And I made it, and there were eggs. That's right, eggs, that's the other ingredient. And I made this eggnog. Swamiji intuited from a distance that there was going to be something wrong. And it was afternoon of Christmas Eve, and the party was in the evening. And he lived at Ayodhya, which was 6-8 miles away, and the meditation retreat still is like 3 or 4 miles back on a very rough, unpaved road. And the last part of it up to the seclusion retreat was just a terrible, rutted road. And I lived up there. Many of us lived up at the seclusion retreat, so the transportation wasn't an issue, but Swami didn't. And Seva would drive him in a little VW Bug, I think is what they drove at that point. And So in the afternoon, Swami decides to come up. Of course, it was beginning to snow really hard. It was turning into a blizzard. So he came up in the afternoon, and he wanted to see how things were going. And he comes into the kitchen, and he asks if he can taste the eggnog. And I just presented it to him. Maybe I had bought whipped cream, because cream is a natural ingredient, so I'd probably whipped up the cream, and eggs were okay. But I'd made the condensed milk out of raw honey and a double dose of powder. And so Swamiji, I put some in a cup, and it probably looked okay. And he took a sip like this. And then he got this look on his face, and he walked over to the sink. Swami's very refined. He walked over to the sink and very delicately just went, he didn't even swallow it. He just let it out of his mouth. And I remember just watching it fall into the sink. And then he said, so tactfully, it doesn't taste quite as I remember it. And I said, oh, how did you make it, Asha? I mean, he knew me well enough. And I told him what I had done. And he was so tactful. He says, this really wasn't what I had in mind. We look out, it's a full blizzard. And we are 4 miles up on a dirt road. And the nearest town is this place called North San Juan, which was about 15 miles away, which is one of those places where if you blink, you missed it. It was just nothing. Now it's a little more, but it was nothing. And there was a gas station and this market where people bought bait for fishing and beer, really. And Swami turns to Seva and says, maybe you could go to North San Juan and get the real ingredients. I mean, would this store have, this stuff? And I said, sir, there's a blizzard outside. And Swami just laughingly says, oh, Seva's a very good driver, just like that. And he pulled some money out of his pocket, or I pulled it out of the cash box. He handed her this money, just sent her off in the blizzard to get Eagle brand sweetened condensed milk and white sugar and whipped cream and eggs and milk. And about an hour and a half later, she comes tootling back up the road. She made it all the way up to the top in this raging storm with all the stuff in a bag. And I just poured the other stuff down the drain, and then we made the whole thing. And just to make sure I didn't forget, so many people that night said, oh, eggnog! It's so delicious. And everybody was so happy with the party. Now, I think that was the end of my fanatical career. What a story, isn't it? It just takes us so long to learn. And that's then when Swami, he said to me at that point, Asha, the way to God is a pure heart, not a pure stomach. And of course I heard it, because I wanted to go to God. But I've eaten, and you should, think about whether it's going to take more to pass it through your body than it's going to give you life force. And cultivate a taste as much as you can for that which gives you energy. Why not? The body is a great obstacle. You don't want to make it worse. Well, God bless you all.